New Orleans is famous for its food, jazz, and vibrant entertainment, but it's also a city steeped in rich history. One of the most significant chapters in its past is the Storyville district. From 1897 to 1917, this designated area was known for prostitution, lively nightclubs, and as a birthplace for a new musical genre, jazz. The entire area was demolished in 1939 to make way for the Iberville public housing development. Today, only 3 buildings from Storyville remain. The corner store at 1216 Bienville once housed Frank Early's My Place Saloon. Just around the corner at 235 Basin Street stood Lulu White's Mahogany Hall, the most famous establishment of the era, though only the first floor survives. Lastly, Joe Victor Saloon was located here at 1534 St. Louis Street. A new museum has opened up in the French Quarter celebrating the history of Storyville, and it's not far from where Storyville was located. And I'm heading there now to check it out. And as I walk up the street here, I'm on Conti. There it is. There's Storyville. Right up here on the right. They've used this whole building here. But you can see there's the sign for it. Right there with the flags and everything. How cool.
So this museum is really dedicated to the sinful side of New Orleans and how Storyville ended up coming to be. But the museum takes you through a journey of, goes, if you will, New Orleans story past. Really as an original French settlement, then basically a Spanish settlement, and then really an early American frontier town, if you will, after the Louisiana Purchase. So what this museum does is it really tells the story, and it documents how New Orleans came to be a city of just a few thousand people to really becoming the 3rd largest city in America in the mid-1800s, because it was a port city. And of course, with the port city, like all port cities, Amsterdam, cities in England, as well as Shanghai in China, it was really a city that brought in a lot of people and also brought with it vice, gambling, prostitution, and alcohol establishments. And New Orleans was no exception. So this was a passion project, pun intended, I guess, if you will, of mine, living in the French Quarter, being born and raised in New Orleans, and of course, always hearing about Storyville. I really took a deep dive and found that it was really a story that needed to be told. And I think what we've done in the museum is we found a lot of artifacts. It's taken a number of years to collect some of these, some very priceless ones. As you'll see, it's the Blue Book we have, which is the directory of prostitution. Also, it was famous because it also has a number of blue chip, I would say, companies advertising in it. So imagine Budweiser and Veuve Clicquot and Mumm Champagne taking full page ads out next to brothels also advertising their wares. So I think it's very interesting from that perspective. But it really, I think, allows locals and tourists to find out something about New Orleans they wouldn't normally, I think, come away with.
To understand New Orleans, you essentially have to start at the very beginning, that the debauchery and a web of lies, if you will, has started from the very beginning, right? The root of the evil starts at the very beginning. We were founded on a Ponzi scheme where they said there was gold and silver, and alas, there was no gold or silver to be found, as we all well know. Then we have Bienville, who asked the Duke of Orleans to send him women because they wanted to build a colony. Orleans was a little bit of a jokester and a little diabolical, if you will. He decided to clear out his prisons of all the prostitutes and thieves and sends those women to New Orleans to start this colony. And I realized, Bienville was like, absolutely not. No, these are not the women we want. So then they send the casket girls. I know a lot of people believe the casket girls came in an actual casket. That is not true. casket just translates from French to English as a purse. So it was just their valuables, whatever they had that could fit in this little chest is what they brought with them.
That's crazy. So everything they owned had to fit in
the
that
box.
one box.
So these are very young girls that they raised up to be virtuous and eligible for marriage to the men, the soldiers and the people actually building the colony. So they didn't have a
much,
lot.
yeah.
No, they didn't have much.
Wow,
They were just
that's crazy.
young girls, probably 12, 13, 14 years old. And when they became of age, they would marry them off. Then from the Battle of Orleans, this is pretty interesting, as the Great Scarlet Migration, we had a wall that surrounded us on Rampart that separated the battles from swamp, essentially, and women that were cooking, cleaning, occupying the men's time on their downtime. But the reason they were following them is because they got paid after they won the battle. So they were basically waiting for their payday. This is the Great Scarlet Migration. So the original sex workers of New Orleans. So things are starting to build now. We won the battle. These girls have somewhere to go. They have to settle down now at this point. The barges, they go down because we don't have steam yet. So they dismantled them here. The swamp district is where the girls kind of settled into this area. That's where the barges would be dismantled and built into these houses and saloons and bar houses, if you will. And the girls would entertain the men and make their money. That's an original piece of a barge ship. It was taken apart. This is what it would have been like and built into this. And it was from these barge ships. It was the men that were working the barges and working on the ships and whatnot. They go to this area. Politicians kind of held court around here. So there's a lot of prostitution houses here as well. But then Europeans with the steam boats would come to this area, and they kind of settled in this area. So now it's starting to kind of get everywhere, and that's pre-Storyville, right? So it's just kind of going all over. There's no designated area. They're infiltrating all the residential zones, and it's kind of started becoming a problem, right? But not too intense yet, so still pre-Storyville. So the Basin Street Red Light District starting to kind of form. This is 1860, 1897. This is just kind of going everywhere, but it's going around. Townsend is quite interesting. If you have a moment, read about her. She was married, but she eventually took a very young lover who he did not agree with and ended up killing her. There's a lot of scandal involved with insurance and banks and different things, so come read about her. She's actually listed right here in the directory, which is pretty interesting. It's an original copy. This is like the original tabloid scandal woman. This is a phenomenal area to take photos with because it makes the skin glow and it takes away any type of blemish or scar, which kind of had a high rate of being with the different diseases that we had back then and didn't have makeup the same way that we do now. But it definitely makes you have a different glow to you. The original IG filter. Okay, so this is Plague of Prostitution is going rampant through New Orleans. They're making political cartoons, and they're really seeing it as a problem at this point, right? People are trying to raise families and just have a good moral standing, if they will. That the prostitution is like no taboo, but it's everywhere. So they're needing a way to control it, right? So then we go into the creation of Storyville. So Storysville was actually created by Sidney Story. He was a very religious man on the council. He was trying to create a way to minimize prostitution in the residential areas. So he came up with this idea to push it to a certain area. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not that it was legal here. They just weren't actually going after the women here as they were everywhere else. So it pushed everyone into that area if they didn't want to be arrested and fined and whatnot. So this was the white and octoroon area, and this was actually the more predominantly black area. The baby dolls are actually the only living relic tied to this area still today. Wow. which is pretty amazing. We've had a few come through, and they absolutely love the whole area, the museum. So it's been really a pleasure to have them in, and for them to give their approval.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was really sweet
Yeah.
to have that connection. And also Louis Armstrong, his mother was a prostitute in this area. He was raised by his grandmother, and jazz kind of originated in this sector right here.
Wow.
So it's really cool to have this here. What's really funny about Sidney's story is, though, he hated that his name was attached to prostitution. He actually ended up getting run out of town, and he went to Chicago because he couldn't take the fact that it was Storyville.
So he didn't name it. It was just
Because
nicknamed
he's
it
the
'cause of
one that
him.
made the ordinance, that it just became Storyville.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't that he wanted it that way. It just is what it was nicknamed, and it stuck. It fit. So Anderson's our original politician. He pretty much had his hand in the pot in every situation. He's listed on the back end of the Blue Book. He created a phenomenal train station, but then put his saloon right across the street. He basically, whatever he wanted to happen, he made it happen, which is, again, very, very New Orleanian.
Yeah.
So he's a quite interesting character. Read about him if you get a chance. The unofficial mayor.
Unofficial mayor.
Exactly. The first Mardi Gras, or one of the first. So these are actually garbage trucks with the mules, and they would just decorate them and make the parades. And then they'd have the balls after, which were very formal. The guys on one side, women on the other side, very boring, all masked. So the men would often sneak into the other ball that the madams held with all the workers, and eventually socialites started trying to get involved because they wanted to see what the fuss was about and see if their husbands were there, I'm sure, or fathers, depending on where you are. So the madams actually worked it out with the police, because you had to have a worker in good standing card back then, and all the socialites did not have this card. So the police raided their ball, and all the socialites had to go get picked up from their daddies or their husbands, because they didn't belong there. So the Blue Book is our first back page, or Craigslist, if you will. Ads to find. Sorry, is that not appropriate?
That's pretty funny.
Sorry, but truly, it was a directory to find the different brothels and different girls, and it would list them. What's interesting is they would have C for color, W for white. They'd have O for octoroon. They'd even have at one point J for Jewish. We don't have those books, but they did have them. This is from 1907 and 1914. And what we've done is digitalize them over here, so you can flip through each page. What's really interesting, let me go all the way back, because that person I told you about a minute ago, Tom Anderson's.
Wow.
This is the original fire map, the most detailed map that you can find. This is at the height of Storyville. And this is also the white to octoroon area, not the predominantly black area. There's two different areas. But this is the map that we have. My running joke, there's, I believe there's 3 shooting ranges, right? So you'd, drink your drinks, dance a little bit, throw some cards down with casinos, mingle with some workers, shoot a few, and hopefully you end up in church and not the cemetery. This is Tom Anderson. He created this, and to show the magnitude, you can see how small the people were, how grand compared to the building. It's a travesty they tore this down, but it's right on the other side, right where Rampart is now. The irony here is that this is Tom Anderson's saloon that's directly across the street from where you exit.
Oh, really?
Not that he had a hand in that at all. So, and there's believed to have been a fling or so with Tom Anderson and Arlington, because Tom Anderson's Arlington saloon. So, and she's quite, right next to him. So the famous madams, the biggest brothels were literally right across the street from when you got off the train. So women would actually get their children and move to the other side of the train before they stopped, because the women would be in the windows and, scantily dressed for their standards,
right.
Fully dressed for ours, but, it was risque back then. So we had Arlington, Lulu White, which is the most famous for octoroons, and what they considered exotic during the day, or taboo, if you will. That's what she was the queen of. She was absolutely gorgeous in her heyday. Right here, you can see a photo of her. Absolutely stunning. And here is what would have been like in a higher end brothel, where you'd say $5 quality over quantity. The gentleman would sit down with the madam with a bottle of champagne, have a glass, and the girls would present themselves like this. And again, this was, considered risque then, but by all means, it wasn't as scandalous as Bourbon Street. So Franklin Street, we go from Basin Street to Franklin Street. These are the saloons, the dance halls, the gambling. It wasn't just prostitution. This is where people went to unload and have just a really good time entertaining each other. They would hold business here, the guys, similar to what they do now at different locations around town. They have their drinks and they talk business, and eventually get a bourbon or Frenchman, So same idea. This is where jazz kind of had its foothold as well. This is where they were allowed to play a little bit different dynamic of music, and it was celebrated. Well, these were the cribs. This was the quantity over quality. You were charging 25 cents to turn a trick, as they called them. And it's similar to the vibes of Amsterdam, where the women are in the windows. Same kind of feel, same idea. They would hang out of the doors, hang out of the windows, and essentially advertise themselves to try to lure men in. Cat call, as you can kind of hear from right there. The idea of this area was to give you a feel for what the girls felt like. So these are the windows. This is, what essentially a crib would look like inside. A bed, a wash basin, maybe some alcohol. But the socialites would see you in the window and be aghast because they don't want to be seen here, and they'd run off. Right, so they'd have a client, they'd close the window, do what they need to do, and then move on to the next.
So jazz really started in the streets of New Orleans, in the area of actually where City Hall is today. There was actually an area called Uptown Storyville, but even before Storyville, in the late 1890s, there was this new sound that was coming out of the honky tonks and such, and it was actually Buddy Bolden was considered the first jazz musician. He's widely credited at that. Unfortunately, this is the only solo picture of him, and this is actually the only picture of him with his orchestra. He played the cornet, and he was famous for playing the clarinet very loudly, but he is widely believed as being the father of jazz, or certainly the leader of the first jazz band. And he was committed to it's interesting, I think Jelly Roll Morton actually forgot that Buddy Bolden hadn't died. He said, when Buddy Bolden died in 1907, Buddy Bolden actually was committed in 1907, and nobody heard from him. Unfortunately, he languished there until his death in 1931. But so here's the thing about Storyville and jazz. So jazz didn't start in Storyville. It started a few years before, but Storyville was definitely the perfect environment for it to flourish, and it plays a really important part. It's in a rapid development because it provided so many jobs for all these musicians, and it allowed them the freedom to experiment, because not all men were there to listen to jazz. They were kind of there for other things. So the musicians would have a little fun with it, and they kind of really fine-tune the basically genre of music. And then the other thing Story did was, when it closed, it gave all these musicians, it took all the jobs away from musicians, so they had to go somewhere else. And so they went to Chicago, they went to LA, they went to New York, they went to Paris, and they took jazz with them. And that's the irony of all types of New Orleans music, is that it's invented here, but the musicians have to go elsewhere to make money, unfortunately, because the city can't support.
Were they primarily playing in Storyville?
So Storyville had the bulk of it. There were the most, you'll see in another room, there were 60 clubs, cabarets, bars in Storyville. Yeah, it was a huge district, and it was almost 400 brothels, ton of clubs, bars, honky tonks, so they were playing there. Now inside the brothels, generally, it was just a piano, and it was it all had mechanical pianos, or most of them had mechanical pianos, which could be played with a quarter if the pianist, which they call the professor, and that's where the name professor came from.
Okay.
they would play, but if they took a break or if it was a slow night, they would just feed the quarters into the machine.
Wow.
And this is actually an example of an early 1900s, probably 1910. They called it a Nickelodeon, but in this case, it took a quarter, so it was definitely in a brothel. And it also plays with a tambourine, a drum, like a xylophone type instrument. It was kind of the early jukebox. Of course, Jelly Roll himself,
yeah.
who was a great musician, also a bit of a braggart. He actually claims he invented jazz. People have a laugh at that, but he certainly had a hand in it. And he left early. He actually started very early, at about 17 years old. His friends told him that there was an opening at one of the brothels, and he made more money that night than he'd ever seen in his life.
Wow.
And then he started sneaking out. He told his family he was just going to work the late shift at the barrel making factory. And it worked for about a year, and then his grandmother saw him one morning coming home when she was coming home from church, and he was coming home from the brothels all pimped out. And so they kicked him out of the house, but it didn't matter at the time because he was making like the equivalent of $500 a night, which was more than his dad was making.
Right.
So.
Wow.
The best piano player, even according to Jelly Roll, which is a lot since he thought he was the best, but he said Tony Jackson was the best composer, and he wrote the song Pretty Baby, which was the famous song in the movie Pretty Baby. It was based on a lot of things, but they used the song in it. And this really shows you the evolution of jazz in New Orleans. We came out of our brass bands, the love for brass bands in the city. You'd have a brass band for everything.
Oh, of course.
You know, funerals, parties, anything. And the instruments are interesting. You know, violins, stringed instruments, guitars, bass, and a lot of brass. And so that kind of evolved into more of the brass band we have today, more of the jazz band, which is kind of that's the classic jazz band. And that's actually a picture of Louis Armstrong and Joe Oliver in New York.
Wow.
In Chicago. When they left New Orleans after Storyville closed. That's around 1923. And also in 1917. So not only did the musicians end up spreading and going to other cities to find work, the first jazz record comes out in 1917 too.
Oh, wow.
So you have this amazing popularity because now people can play it. So they wonder what it is. So all this was exploding at the same time. So New Orleans in the 1800s was the gambling capital of America. We had over 500 licensed casinos in the city. And mind you, this was a city of 200,000 people, so it was a lot of gambling per person. Poker was invented in New Orleans. It was a very simple French game that was modified. It was just basically 5 cards. There was no draw. You got your 5 cards, you bluffed and you bet, and then you basically flipped them. So it was a very, very rapid game. And then the riverboat men took that north. Eventually, we added additional cards and a draw to allow more people to play and allow the bets to get higher.
Wow.
And then roulette was a French game, but it was brought to New Orleans. The first place in America it was brought was the casinos of New Orleans, and that's like a very old roulette table. And then around the same time, Bernard Maroney, whose plantation became the Maroney neighborhood, very wealthy French Creole New Orleanian, probably one of the richest men in Louisiana at one point in time, brings the game of craps, or a modification of the game of craps, back to America. And it gets its name actually because craps was a derivation from the French word for frog. And the Americans would use basically the word frog to call the French. It was kind of a disparaging because they ate frog legs, but also because they would stoop over and play on the ground and they look like frogs. So that's how the word craps came out.
I never knew that. That's
so
cool.
crapaud was the French word, and then they shortened it to craps, basically frog. And these are the peep show machines I was talking about. So these would be a penny, and then they would flip through the different pictures, and it's interesting because photography was fairly new. They're 3-dimensional, like the old viewfinders. So you actually, one eye sees one side, the other eye sees the other side. The nightclubs, or the brothels I should say, were really big into champagne. And all these represents alcohol that was advertised in the Blue Book. So we have Veuve Clicquot, Mum's, Piper, Moet Chandon, in original bottles from the early 1900s. And then whiskey is a favorite in the honky-tonks and the bars. And these are all brands that were widely advertised and drank. Harper's Rye, Paul Jones, Congress rye. Ryes are very popular. And of course beer. So these are like original bottles from the early 1900s, Falstaff, Budweiser. A lot of times they wouldn't put labels on them, they would just emboss the bottles. And then we do have some that actually have labels that manage to stay on. We have a bit on absinthe because absinthe was really popular in Paris and in New Orleans in the late 1800s until it was banned in 1914 for causing hallucinogenic effects and also people going crazy. There were a lot of murders blamed on absinthe fiends.
Oh my God.
But it was kind of ironic is that hard drugs like opium, cocaine, heroin were actually banned 2 years after absinthe was banned. And I guess it was because heroin fiends were probably, or morphine fiends were probably less likely to be violent than he would just fall asleep in a corner.
Probably true.
Yeah.
This is Belloc. He took photos of the women. He actually made them look human and not objects, which I love about him. I love this because it shows them as real people.
Yeah.
You know, some of them really enjoyed what they did. Some of them, did what they had to do in life to survive.
It's a job.
You know, there's a whole thing about why their faces are scratched out. We're not sure. There's a lot of different theories. Some say it's because they got out of the industry. They didn't want to be associated with it anymore. Some say it was the brother that was a priest that did it. But we just don't know. This is actually original plate that we backlit. That is Belloc's. This is his parlor. It would have been like to actually go in a place like Arlington or Lulu White's brothel. There's bottles of champagne if you look hard enough in there. It's literally what it would have been like to go
it's
inside.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
This is one of his original photos. It's carbon dated 1920 or before, so it is an actual Belloc photo. These are originals as well, permanent collection that we collected from, and these are prints from a World's Fair that we have on display as well.
That's amazing that y'all have these.
Okay, so now we're going into the end of Storyville. The World War I broke out, the dress styles changing, mind frames around things are starting to change as well. The mayor is very, very upset about this situation because he knows it's not gonna stop prostitution. And his famous saying is, you can make prostitution illegal, but you can't make it unpopular. So no matter what the general said about dismantle it, our men are dropping like flies from syphilis. It was a real big issue for them. We got to dismantle Storyville, and the mayor knew they're still gonna do what they're gonna do. So that was the end. So curtains fall. Storyville's going down. They're going through like Mardi Gras after they're done, and they sweep through the city. They're, on their horses and make you disperse. Same kind of situation. They were just driving all the prostitutes out. And I think this is one of my favorite little cartoons. Storyville, no! And he's running the devil out. And this is what an original crib would have looked like that we were in earlier. The different buildings. It's sad that all these gorgeous buildings were torn down, but that's what it looks like now, the same areas. You can get into this sound bubble as well and hear Goodbye Storyville here. Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday. It's a beautiful song, but it's saying goodbye to Storyville. That's the end. It's a beautiful film. Pretty Baby, Brooke Shields. Very hard to watch, but very accurate to what Storyville was like with the babies born in the area and what would often happen to the girls. They grow up in this environment and unfortunately would probably go into the same industry. We are not encouraging it or saying it's right. We're just showing what legitimately happened. And it's really heartbreaking, but real.
Yeah.
But it's a real situation that happened. This movie is a great depiction of the reality that a lot of these poor girls faced. He created every storyboard.
That's amazing.
He wrote every storyboard. He created the entire mapping, the timeline of how it occurred.
Yeah.
This truly is his baby. It's a beautiful tribute to Storyville.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm very impressed. Very impressed.
Awesome.